Hello everyone, today we talk about the Lithuanian Boyars equipment of the second half of the 14th century, basing ourselves especially on the seal of Vytautas' father, Kęstutis, Duke of Trakai between 1345 and 1382, and Grand Duke of Lithuania 1377-1382. So really talking about the equipment and highlighting in fact what were the main characteristics of this, we can extend even a timeline here from the mid 14th century to the somewhat even the beginnings of the 15th Lithuanian noblemen's equipment, right? So naturally about the elites we tend to know more. In general, the elites naturally are more powerful, they can represent themselves better, they have more money, they iconographically speaking here we base ourselves, for example, on seals, right? So not even necessarily archaeological, like even proper armor, proper weapons, etc., but also looking at how they wanted to be portrayed like. So trying to give very briefly a bit of historical context, you know that Lithuania is during the 14th century this major pagan power in Eastern Europe that has fundamentally emerged from the progressive cohesion of this set of principalities or kingdoms, as they call themselves, that more or less were moved, but they probably felt a common identity. They had kind of common enemies. So actually the metus hostilis in many cases in history, almost all the time, actually helps in progressively strengthening up the cohesion of a people and to react to organize itself better from a political and military point of view. As you know, the Lithuanians have their major enemies in the Teutonic orders in the west. In the mid 14th century, the Lithuanian let's say state kind of is revived and is expanded towards the east against the Russians. So it's a very fascinating entity because it's really in between so many different worlds, and the great choice at the end of the century will be in fact for the west, but it could have gone really differently, depends also because here political ambiguities and the lack of a true centralized state bring to all the difficulties that you can imagine. Anyhow, from a strictly military point of view, you observe that there is definitely a strengthening of this power. There is the creation of the Grand Duchy proper, and this kind of surpasses the traditional, let's say, tribal aristocratic system based on the kings and the boyars. The boyars were fundamentally conceived as the lesser nobility for the structuration of a kind of more sound clientele that naturally brings the elites to equip themselves in a always more expensive way, more effective ways. This is interesting because these areas of Europe are fairly, say, poor. So they also, in terms of technical know-how, they absorb a lot also from other countries. Also, and especially from the West. This was true even for a close country like Poland. There are kind of similar comparisons that can be done in this sense. I think I made a video about something like medieval Polish tactics, between the 11th and 13th century, that partly addressed the matter, even if it doesn't specifically talk about Lithuania. As we will see in this video, there were actually some similarities, pretty interesting similarities between the two systems that will end up to unite, as you know. Given also a little bit of context, here we mentioned Vytautas and his father Kęstutis, whose seals we're gonna look at. So starting in chronological order, very very briefly, Kęstutis was Prince of Lithuania between he lived actually a freaking lot for the time. He was born in 1297 and died in 1382. He was son of Gediminas, if I'm not wrong here with the pronunciation. Help me also if you know the pronunciation better. And his father had split in 1341 the principality among his own 7 sons. So you can imagine also all the problems, the internal fight, even the rivalries and competition that existed within the nobility. So Kęstutis, basically together with his brother Algirdas, took away to the other brothers every effective authority, let's say, keeping the unity of the great Lithuania, right? Imagine also all the opportunities deriving from this, always dictated by political compromises with the nobility, etc. But the idea of having a leader, especially in times of war, is dramatically important, and the whole system can benefit. The Lithuanians were pretty warlike. Remember it; they were really coming from a pretty strong, with tribal, warlike background. So Algirdas kept the title of Great Duke, and he had his own sphere of influence, mostly in the eastern side, so the eastern policy, while Kęstutis dealt in the west with the threat posed by Teutonic knights. So at the death of Algirdas in 1377, Kęstutis backed also the rise to the throne of Algirdas' son, his nephew, and but his nephew sided secretly with the Teutonic knights against his uncle. So Kęstutis, first phase, manages actually to take the throne away from him in 1381, but at the end he was defeated, and in fact he died in prison. About Vytautas, instead, he was Kęstutis' son, as we have seen, and cousin of Jagello, the sovereign that will effectively accomplish the personal union between the Lithuanian and the Polish state. And Vytautas was born in 1350. He died in Vilnius on October 27th, 1430. So here they were pretty long living stock for the time, and in his youth, Vytautas had to suffer the violences of his own cousin that captured him, together with his father Kęstutis, as we have seen, during an ambush, interestingly enough, and he was imprisoned as well. He, however, managed to escape, and he began this personal policy of eminently national, say, character. National meant, let's say, in the Latin sense of the word, in this Lithuanian context, that made of him, of Vytautas, definitely a kind of a representative hero in the memory of his own country. So this is a quite important figure. So in order to cope with his own cousin, he allied himself with the Teutonic order that was fighting against the Poles at this time, that was also in strained relation with, and this basically persuaded his own cousin to appoint him, to name him Great Duke of Lithuania. So from his new position, he managed to extend the borders of the Great Duchy of Lithuania, fighting against the Tatars and the Russians, and he also judged to have come to the point to basically weaken sensibly the power of the Teutonic order that was always kind of hungry of Lithuanian and Slavic territories, and that at this point, chiefly because of the Lithuanian-Polish alliance, and because of the good disposition towards the same of the Pope and of the Holy Roman Emperor Sigismund, he found itself in a condition of, let's say, moral and material inferiority. So the war that we also mentioned before was provoked by a rebellion of the Lithuanians of Samogitia, that is this area of this historical region that comprehends the western part of Lithuania. This is a relatively hilly territory, rather fertile, low hills, even with certain glacial sediments at the base, and against the Teutonic order. And that's what brings eventually to the Battle of Pandenburg on July the 15th, 1350. That is won by Vytautas against the great master of the Teutonic Order after the useless siege of Marienburg. That was the capital of the same order, and that was concluded eventually with the Peace of Thorn in 1411. And as we were saying before, this battle, it's very, very famous medieval history, as you know, and it was a kind of a pretty heavy blow, a shattering blow to the Teutonic power. And after having regulated relations with Poland, with the Union of Rodlo, I think in 1413, Vytautas hoped to seize the royal crown of Lithuania, and he, in this sense, backed the Emperor Sigismund in order to support him. But Jagiello, at this point, fearing that the royal dignity conferred to his cousin would have, especially with the accentuated separation of the two states, weakened the position of Poland, he opposed himself to Vytautas, and he, in fact, Vytautas never came to wear the crown, in spite of all his further insistences. So, but what is important is that under Vytautas, Lithuania reached the kind of the apogee of his own power and could maintain for a longer time, definitely its independence in front of Poland. And Vytautas is definitely a very fascinating figure. He was well aware of Western culture, Western European culture. He was fairly tolerant in religion. He called at his court Jews, even Muslims, and Orthodoxes and Latins, etc. And he being the son of a pagan prince, he, however, wanted the conversion of his own country to happen by grades, fundamentally. So, for example, he deplored the death of Jan Hus had been authorized the Constance Council by Emperor Sigismund. And in fact, for this reason, he was even offered by the Hussites the Bohemian crown, that he, however, was wise enough to refuse in that condition, and in that situation. And after his death, that was without heirs, or at least without direct heirs, he basically brought Lithuania under the Jagiellonian dynasty. So, as you understand, these are pretty big figures, right? And this is the very elite of Lithuania. So that's where you can find the best panoply ever from these seals and from these figures. We also named Trakai, the Duchy of Trakai, where they came from. And in fact, this is still standing. It's a historical building of Trakai in Lithuania on the Lake Galve, I think it's pronounced. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And the construction of this castle began, in fact, in the 14th century by Kęstutis. And around 1409, it was almost completed by Vytautas, that also died in the castle of Trakai in 1430. And Trakai was definitely, imagine what Lithuania could be. Lithuania was covered like 1/4 in marshlands and the other like in forests. So it was a pretty tough ground. Also the reason why it was so damn difficult for the Teutonic to expand into it. And also this definitely characterized local warfare in a certain particular way. So Trakai was a pretty massive building for Lithuanian standard, and it had an enormous strategical importance. It was definitely one of the most important, one of the principal centers of the Great Duchy of Lithuania at this time. And this is at least for the 14th century. That Trakai also had a pretty interesting story afterwards, but let's skip it for now. So, talking about the equipment proper. So, first of all, talking about Lithuanian warfare, consider one thing: Lithuanians were known as pretty damn good cavalrymen. This is a characteristic that was shared by, at this time it's really difficult to tell whether, it was like a local ethnic tradition, because basically all Europe had pretty good cavalry in some sense. But let's say Eastern Europe was more exposed to the Eurasian traditions of the steppes. It had kind of remained into a sort of a great migration era with many foes that also came as at different stages from the steppes. Think about what happened with the Mongols, but also think in general what the various threats. So there were huge distances to cover. Cavalry was quite important as a strategic asset in this sense, and definitely the Lithuanians had their own infantry, but cavalry remained a bit of the symbol of this population. In fact, in its coat of arms, in this traditional symbol that there is the knight, right, on the red background. In fact, the white knight, white and red are the colors of the Lithuanian coat of arms. And that we find, in fact, already since that time, I believe, as a bit, let's say, the Lithuanian colors, let's put it in this way, just for... And so, looking at the 1378 seal, we look... So, I made this premise about cavalry to make you understand, however, how important kind of chivalric tradition and culture, even devoid of aside from the Western European developments of chivalry and feudalism, etc., was strong in Eastern Europe in many ways. These were populations that had not really developed feudalism so heavily and so intensely like in the West, because they kind of had less assets. So they were in origin more egalitarian, so they came later to further structuration of this, let's say, of the clienteling system that you can define in a sort of feudal, quasi-feudal way, essentially. So this had, let's say, it's the evolution from a people that traditionally, differently from Western Europe, was pretty well versed into horse riding, right? Traditionally speaking, this is typical of Eastern Europe, that like the average freeman warrior was considered at least capable of riding pretty well, something that in the West had ended from a lot of time, because feudalism had, the Western Europe, the sedentarism was much more accentuated. Also, feudalism easily disarms and very early disarms the countryside, the populations. So in the East, in the lack of centralization, you have still a higher tradition of kind of freedom that had maintained this peoples in their more traditional warfare, right? So this is a phase instead that, as we have seen, is bringing the further structuration of a true elite that, however, still maintains in its kind of national identity, always meant in not in the 19th century sense, but in the more ancient sense, the idea that horsemanship is a great value, right? The horseman is the cool guy at the end of the story. And naturally, at this point, the horseman is becoming increasingly more the elite, the aristocrat, the oligarch. So, together with the political structuration of Lithuania, the importance of heavier cavalry, of heavily armored elite cavalry increases, right? And not that this type of cavalry didn't exist before, but it was probably on average more diluted. We can imagine. Here, instead, with a greater concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer people, you can have more elite, right? It's as if the broadly speaking, this progressive social stratification was a constant in medieval Europe, right? With some fluctuation, but especially in certain countries, pretty clear, with a really pretty basic trend, linear trend, let's say better. So looking at the 1378 seal, that is what we are basing ourselves about, we see a certain particular characteristics of Lithuanian equipment. The first one, I would say, is the say Samojitsin style, Lithuanian or Samojitsin style armor, comprising a mail coif, shoes, and an hauberk, plus a lamellar corselet and a capelline helmet. So we're gonna take this into consideration. This equipment is, in fact, kind of typical, as we said before, the mid-14th century / early 15th century Lithuanian Samojitsin knights. So the mail coif, as you know, is this protection for that covered the head. It's a flexible hood of mail extended to cover the throat, the neck, and the top of the shoulders. Here there is no standardization of any kind. Naturally, just for functional reasons, this is a type of armor that you find widespread, basically throughout the whole Middle Ages. In this kind of covering form, you find it expanding in as a kind of a pretty widespread part of the armor from especially the 10th century. So with this close-fitting cap that covers the top, back, and sides of the head. And always bear in mind that underneath this armor there was a padded armor that could absorb the blows, didn't create friction between the skin and the metal, isolated also in terms of temperature, because fighting with an armor, either where if it's cold you freeze, if it is hot you boil, so it's not really, that's pretty useful. Also in here it comes in many ways. Probably there was some form of aventaille as well, but that's pretty standard. It could vary, as we have seen. The shoes, instead, are armor for the legs that are usually made from mail, and they could extend to sometimes up to the knee. Sometimes they could cover the entire leg. So they actually had become a standard type of leg armor in Europe from the 11th century up to the 14th, when eventually plate armor basically substitutes mail armor even for the legs, but not always, because definitely not all troops could wear plate armor, so this was still pretty common. Always remember that the mail is a excellent, especially for protection, especially for stopping cuts, not really for piercing. It's better than nothing, obviously, also against piercing. The development of plate armor that starts from the mid 13th century fundamentally, and at this point in the second half of the 14th century starts taking over. We will see to basically envelope the warrior. Initially there were mail joints between the various plates, then eventually it becomes full plate armor in the 15th century, as you know. That's ultra elite though, and it has also certain particular field employment as typology of unit, as you can imagine, because of the weight, because of the elite, the prestige, the wealth, the cost that it had, etc. We will see later, by the way, how this type of equipment that we are documenting from the seal, and there are others, maybe we will look at them into another video, that kind of documents a kind of typically Lithuanian equipment, also was cited by types of armor that actually came straight from Western Europe, chiefly from Germany in this case, but also from other countries that were pretty advanced into armor production. And so this talking for the shows. So that there is a hybrid, essentially. There are kind of local traditions mixing with others ones. And believe me, especially in terms of military, usage, etc., nobody has ever minded very much about taking someone else's style, type of armor, as long as it fitted and it worked. By the way, Eastern European aristocracies were pretty receptive, historically speaking. They really didn't make a fuss. Also in terms of type of weapons, equipment, the Polish-Lithuanian Cavalry, for example, in the early modern age, seemingly had a pretty solid taste for handguns on horseback, right? But so that's also a different type of of military tradition that influences this kind of orientations that is to be taken in mind. Then, as we were saying, there is this cuirass, this the oberk, of course. So this body armor, mail that covers basically all the chest and arms, and can go down to the thighs sometimes, and perfectly also here anatomic, pretty sound and robust protection. And plus, and here that's really the ultra elite for the time. Consider that it's not that Lithuania was particularly affluent at this point, so having this type of armor really meant you were ultra elite. You were really big guys, very well connected to the top in a way or another. This lamellar corselet that could be made of in different ways. I think here the picture that I showed you, even if it's blurry, it's meant to represent sort of lamellar corselet with certain rectangular plates tied to each other, so to absorb the blows. But there were really many ways. At this point, there was also kind of a big, full single breastplate for the front and another from the back that could be tied. That's at least how armor was developing in Western Europe. So naturally, there were several combinations, and every piece was unique in its own kind. So, but that's a pretty solid, armor at that point. That's ultra elite. Basically, no weapon of the time, aside from artillery, certain type of artillery, could smash you through that level of protection, at least for the chest. And there is this Capelin helmet that you find in different forms. That would be, I think, Capelin in this Eastern European context means it's a bit of a loose term. There's nothing particularly specific. Would be the chapelle de fer. Or that however in this Eastern European context sometimes you find in an almost conical shape that is a bit, in fact, iconic of Eastern Europe. You find it very widespread, and naturally that's conceived to deflect the blows, and obviously to protect the head, and that's pretty much it. So also in here, not excessively different from the average man-at-arms in Europe at this point. What is interesting that has sparked some curiosity and controversy, also because we always bear in mind that we do not know much about this context in general. I mean, it's already difficult to understand the details of equipment, of armor evolution, of tactics, of areas in Europe that are way more documented than this. But what is somehow fascinating is the shield. Now, what about the shield? So this type of shield, basically, you find it's a relatively small shield, kind of quadrangular in form, with this solid, broad rim. That is not just usually that in shields the rim is often just the metal part, a relatively thin metal part, or just like the umbo that protects essentially the hand. Here it's really the shield that is reinforced in wood, or any other organic material it could be made of, or even some plaques of metal, telling the truth, but that's another typology we'll see later. In the middle, with a great thick part in wood, right? So that adds extra protection. Remember, wood is pretty resistant, so even if it's not metal, it can deflect. Can absorb pretty heavy blows. And this shield is particularly interesting for one reason. First of all, we'll see now, he's often described as Bohemian. And I don't really know why. I suspect because eventually it was developed in certain areas of Central Europe, maybe Bohemia, but not only, as particular type that actually matches with the so-called Pavese type. That is a type of shield we have, actually, that we have to talk really a lot about, because normally the Pavese is stereotypically in mind what starts appearing, in fact, from the late Middle Ages, especially for crossbowmen, but not only really, as this quite iconic type of shield, usually tall, relatively large, but still, tall and narrow compared, to the very comparing the two, width and height, and with, in fact, this central rim that kind of that is obviously there for protection, especially if it is worn by someone on the back. It protects the spine, of course. This was used chiefly by crossbowmen exactly because they tended to crouch and to rotate the back towards the enemy, so that they could be protected by the shield while they were reloading. So that broad rim served as extra protection to their spine, their body line. So it kind of became Bohemian, but the history described as Bohemian, especially in this, I think, quadrangular shape. The history of the Pavese is really more complicated, and it has several areas of Europe where it similarly started to be used. So, for what concerns this Eastern offspring, actually, in Lithuanian and Mazovian seals from the 13th century on, this type of shield appears already, right? So it's, I think, the beginning of the 13th century, first half of the 13th century. I don't really know about the date. I think, there is this seal of Conrad of Mazovia of 1228. So definitely, this is a date in which in Bohemia it was still not witnessed, so it's improperly called Bohemian. So Conrad of Mazovia, and this is also interesting to learn, because it has to do also with the general influences that we can find in these military traditions, and compared towards, from the external, let's say, Conrad, Duke of Mazovia, was the second-born son of Kazimir II Sprawiedliwy. If I'm not, I probably mispronounced this in Polish. He lived between 1188 and 1247, and he had a pretty strong Western contacts. In 1223, he had encouraged the Teutonic Order to fight the pagan Prussians, and in 1226 he also had this agreement that was eventually sanctioned by the Emperor Frederick II with the great master Hermann von Salza, for which the Teutonic Order was installed on the lower Vistula in the land of Kelmno, and from there, the Teutonic Order was to extend its own dominion to the entire Prussia until the Niemen. So this was definitely a figure that belonged to that Polish aristocracy who had very strong contacts with this Western, let's say, military traditions, Poland had undergone a sensible westernization also in armor, in warfare in general, especially the northwest of it. In this case, those territories, Mazovia is in the northeast, but that's where basically the Teutonic Order starts spreading from. So they, as you know, many Polish, albeit the Teutonic Order is installed in Poland as a vassal of the Polish king, many Polish aristocrats go to fight for the Teutonics into the Baltic Crusades. So they actually acquire. They are massively influenced. Also, a lot of Polish military lexicon from the time is pretty heavily Germanized, and it has, in this sense, a lot of it is reflected in the equipment as well, in the weapon, in the armor, etc. So this kind of Bohemian shield has much more ancient origins than when it, at least when it appears in Bohemia, up to in the first half of the 13th century, and it appears, in fact, in this Lithuanian and Mazovian seals from the 13th century on, right? So this also tells you how Lithuanian and lands as Mazovia were kind of close, also in terms of military tradition. Now, many people say, you know, okay, having given this, there is a further specification to be made, because basically there is a source from the 15th century that, if I'm not wrong, it's source from Silesia, that at this time, by the way, I think was under the Bohemian under Bohemian control, so that it was a kind of a Bohemian source, you can say, that explicitly states that there were certain types of shields that were known as shields of Lithuania, Lithische Schilde, Pofeisen. This is from 1427. So basically, these were considered as Lithuanian pavises, and they were mostly referred to cavalry versions of the pavise shield, right? That, in this sense, from a Bohemian source, confirm an Eastern origin, a Lithuanian origin, in this case, that could be shared in part from Poland itself. So many people say, well, but what these pavises were about? I mean, why was that they developed or so on? That is, well, the concept is that pavise expands, let's say, originates in several areas, certain areas of Europe at the same time. And there is a bit of debate of this, because people like to think that, you know, if you invent a type of weapon or of armor or shield in this case, you must have taken it from someone. I have a wholly different view of this. I mean, it obviously can happen, but similar forms can be developed in different places at the same time, right? So the point is that the pavise, as we know it, is mostly associated with Italy. Many people said, oh well, also even the pavise term actually comes from Pavia, because traditionally was thought the pavise was made from there. Actually, it's false. I can tell you, because I checked all the most updated bibliography about this, and actually that's just an assonance that an historian from Pavia actually wrote. I don't remember, I think it was the end of the Middle Ages or even the early modern age. I think it was still late Middle Ages, stating that the term pavise comes from pavese, from Pavia essentially, but it's actually wrong. There is no proof of this. And although it is true that pavises developed in Italy more or less at the same time as they were developing we can identify in here in Mazovia and Lithuania. Italian pavizes spread seemingly from Florence for the first time, and in this sense there seems to be and nobody knows why really, but there seems to be a connection with this happens towards the mid 13th century. I think the first evidence is like 1250 exactly, or something like that. And it's interesting because eventually pavizes are to be found in very large numbers, especially in Tuscany, in Florentine armies of the time, also in northeast of Italy, in part in Paduan tradition, but not only, that they're to be found somewhere else. There seems to be, though, especially with the Florentine link, an Angevin connection, because it seems that the Angevins, especially in the Kingdom of Naples, made use of these pavizes. You know that Naples and Florence were strongly allied at that point in the Guelph system. And this is a very early age, right? We are lucky that for Lithuania and Mazovia we have this iconographic evidence from the seals, and even this kind of more or less precise attribution from this 15th century Bohemian source. For Italy, we are kind of, let's say, better documented, but at the same time, we don't have representations of pavizes like that. Like we are plenty of sources that talk about that, but that there were, but we don't actually know about the dimensions. Many people assume that the paviz fundamentally was a large shield, like a camping table, just to make you understand, to protect from projectiles fundamentally, so that it was usually and theoretically put in front of the infantry lines, etc. Now this view has been challenged because effectively there are just a bunch of chronicles that tell this story, but other chronicles actually depict the paviz as something smaller than that, even a weapon that a shield that could be employed by assault troops during sieges, and we have actually a very interesting document from the Angevin court in Naples, where Charles of Anjou, in the late 13th century, basically orders a commission for the equipment of the Angevin navy. That was equipped also with pavizes, and here that's particularly important because it's the only document in which we have the exact measures of that paviz. It's actually a pretty small shield, right? Relatively small shield, definitely not the camping table that we're prone to think about. So eventually pavizes expand towards the late Middle Ages, especially I would say, yes, you find them a bit all over Central Europe, from the south to the east, let's say from Italy to these lands of Lithuania, etc. But you find them pretty widespread elsewhere. Probably there is, I'm not really sure, but there is this bit of characterization of a more specifically Central European thing, because the typical, I don't know, English or French men-at-arms from say the 100 Years' War, it's not usually represented like with a paviz. So the problem is, what was the paviz as early as this time, so what was originated, where its etymology really comes from Latin, and it would be the same one of pavement, right? That's really the meaning, that the paviz is something that paves that protects, that covers, like a layer, right? So that's the objective. That's as if it was not necessarily a thicker shield, but something you can cover with. So I personally have am pretty flexible about this, because I've analyzed a bit of sources from these times across Europe, and I personally believe that these types of shields probably had some slightly more ancient origin in the 13th century. For example, there are Bohemian and Polish shields from times as early as they could be like the 12th century. that are typical of also other Slavic peoples. They can be found, especially with that form, up to Russia, and they were probably also much more ancient, because I'm pretty sure they're documented even for the Varangians, that were rectangular in shield, right? And these were, as a form, really something you find even into Bronze Age Denmark. I mean, they're pretty... but they stand out a little bit, because we... a bit stereotypically and not really devoid of, without sense, we think of them as the shield is usually oval, right, round, especially in during the migration era. We think of this stereotypically round shield, and then eventually by the 11th century, like the drop shape of the Norman shields, the Brazil knot form, etc. But this rectangular shields, in my opinion, probably were somewhat more widespread, because, yeah, by the way, I didn't stress the fact that pavise is normally, let's say, the later pavises, especially the ones we described before about crossbowmen, tended to be ergonomically, they were squared at the bottom. That was usually larger, because it did serve like a base to even fix on the ground sometime. But towards the head, given especially when they were worn on the back, they were kind of round at the top. That's a bit ergonomic. But the concept is that when you have a rectangular shield, and especially if it's not convex, the first thing you think is that it's a type of shield that at least develops for some sort of for covering basically those curvy, let's say, corners, let's say, and make them rectangular, so that basically the bullets that are the projectiles that arrive at that height can be stopped. They don't get through these holes between the line, and therefore you can be a bit more protected. This is particularly interesting because, especially if you consider they were used in countries like Russia or Poland or even Bohemia, you may think that they could be used because of some sort of exposition to maybe horse-archery of the steppes, so that these were shields that were not necessarily so heavy and so cumbersome to be just fixed on the ground, but they worked well in those conditions when you could even maybe crouch behind them. They could form this sort of shield wall where you could be better protected than what an oval shield could do. This is particularly evident also because they're not convex. I repeat it, they're flat. They're not like the Roman rectangular shield that is convex, and contrarily wise to what most people think, that's not good for making a shield wall, because actually it's a more enveloping form made for the individual to fit into it individually. In fact, the best form to make a shield wall is the flat one, right? In fact, it's the same thing you find, many of you probably like Vikings and the shield wall, they're obsessed even about it, but that's something that happened literally throughout all times in history. So pavises, in my opinion, did exist. They had these traditions that were kind of square shields of this form, or that probably were they were not necessarily prevalent forms, but they were around, right? And they could be really of different sizes. I mean, the later shields that we find are usually, in fact, smaller. They were not really conceived as the camping table-like, but initial sources from the 13th century suggest sometimes that they were. So in my opinion, really, when we talk about pavise, given that sources talk about it, not us, the best way to interpret it is basically about probably the characteristics that we don't know much about, because we don't have archaeological finds from that era about pavises that made it kind of a better shield to protect, and they could be really to especially be protected from projectiles that could be of different sizes. I mean, I personally believe that there really were camping tables, like to fix on the ground, that were heavy, that needed even some strength to put there, were kind of a mobile field fortification at the largest. And I also believe that there were these smaller shields which definitely seemed to be, like in the case of this Lithuanian pavises, there were actually small shields, right? Small shields that seemingly were cavalry versions. And it's interesting because there is an offspring of this squared shields that are the ones that you find into the initial Hungarian, let's say, late medieval and early modern, say, medieval hussars from these Balkanic areas, like in Hungary or in Croatia, that they were a bit iconic. They were usually smaller. There was also cavalry shields for light cavalry. So there's a lot of blending of this stuff, and the question remains, though, is that why would the Lithuanians develop a type of pavis in the sense that this squared, that is small and has this broad rim that protects? So, as we were saying before, Lithuanians were cavalrymen, right? And they were exposed to a lot of steppes warfare. At this point, Russian armies were practically identical, for example, to the one of the Tartars. Definitely was a lot of firepower coming even from other countries in the south. Even development of crossbows in the west. Fighting against the Teutonics, etc. So the concept of the pavis, as we have seen, is to offer extra protection. And definitely these shields seem to be conceived to be thicker, at least with a broader rim in the center. The fact that they're smaller suggests that they're cavalry shields. So that's basically a shield that you wear on horseback to protect from projectiles more than using it necessarily really in melee, right? You obviously can use it in melee. You use everything in melee, but this seems to be mostly like those shields that maybe you just even tie to your arm, or that you have this extra reinforcement that can even follow as a broad rim the line of your arm, especially if you're on horseback. So this is particularly interesting because these shields, in fact, are not very big. So they, especially if you fight on foot with that suggests kind of a pretty dynamic fencing in some way. There is also to say that the more you're armored, and this is definitely the case of the average Lithuanian boyar, the less you need shields. Like, this is basically the history of shields in medieval chivalry. You have initial shields, like at the time of the Normans, that were pretty big. They were this drop shield that protected the larger part on the top, like kind of the chest and part of the head. They followed down up to the leg with the point of the drop, towards, in fact, downwards. And that's because you basically had only mail armor. When plate armor starts spreading, what happens since the 13th century is that shields become smaller immediately, right? Because it's not that a shield is something, if you're covered in armor, in metal armor with padded cloth, mail, extra armor like plates, what do you have a wooden shield for? It's just cumbersome. But the fact that it existed so often in Lithuania, and it also saw a big deal of horse-archery because it had this pretty solid influence from the east as well, as we have seen traditionally, is that when you're on a horse archer, you basically have to use both of your hands at least for stretching the bow and and grabbing the bow. So you can't move the shield. So it's typical of horse archers to have usually smaller shields, preferably on the left side, because still the right side is used to aim more more in a more agile way with less weight on your right arm, and also to grab, say, other weapons, like could be a sword or a dagger or something. So my idea is that albeit these kinds of Lithuanian pavises were probably used in the most diverse ways. Probably their origin stemmed from horse archery. I think it does make sense. Sadly enough, you find other peoples that use horse archery didn't quite have something like that. So these pavises seem, however, to be kind of a better type of shield than the average. I mean, I think that if you even find the average Lithuanian horse archer, let's say, you will not necessarily find different forms. But at the same time, so this could evolve over time from relatively flat shields that tend to reinforce themselves in the center, exactly to in the center rim to protect usually the soldier's arm grip. Right. Also because in Lithuania there's a lot of skirmishing. Like traditional Lithuanian cavalry is light. Think about the terrain of Lithuania. You can have ultra heavy cavalry, like it was like a French plain when you're fighting into swamps and into forests. So the tradition in here is that there is a lot of projectiles flying in the air, and you need extra protection for a shield that probably is really is developed in a much more anti-projectile function that what, let's say, the average Western shield is about, right? And this keeps, as a form, as a concept, repeating itself in Eastern Europe, right? So this is particularly important because in that environment, also with the arrival of the Turks, etc., there is a continual range action of horse archery that especially has a very high rate of fire, as you know. So even more than the crossbow, that at that point cannot really protect you more than much, because you need really a very thick weapon at that point to protect yourself from a crossbow, for which plate armor in fact is developed that is more resistant definitely than the wooden shield. Well, that thing in the East probably remains so fashionable because it kind of makes sense. So it's even possible, by the way, that Italian pavises, for example, were more like that, let's say, camping table on average than they were in the East. Right, so that they were heavier, they were bigger because there was more crossbow fire involved, and especially frontally speaking, pitched battles, but also during sieges, as you know. So I'm not saying that there weren't crossbows in Lithuania, but let's say that in Eastern Europe, broadly speaking, it was mostly bows, normal bows that are employed largely on a larger scale. So this is an hypothesis on why that could be, ergonomically speaking, functionally speaking, the best type of shield you could use in that context, right? And it's interesting because, in fact, if you compare it to like Bohemian warfare, that is largely like Germany at this point, the German one, it's different from the Lithuanian one. That even compared to the Polish one, has a much more horse archery oriented character, let's say, in this sense. So this is my hypothesis. That's how I think it could have emerged in that sense. So that 15th century Bohemian source could say these are Lithuanian pavises for cavalry, right? That's my take on it, and I don't have other proofs about this. Always, however, advising you never to be dogmatic, saying, because many people say, oh well, the pavis, what was it? Was it first invented among the Slavs and then it passed into places like Italy, or was it invented in Italy then it passed elsewhere? It's not really, apologically speaking, a question that makes sense, because really, it's not that there are so many ways to make a shield. I mean, it's not that an Italian or a Lithuanian were dumb that they had to copy it from a shield like this from someone else. I mean, the concept within it is so clear that weapons are formed simply because they are evidently practical. that way. You don't need someone else telling you, use this form. I never thought about it, thanks. And that's how technology works. Technology does not work like that. And by the way, this still doesn't happen while you find it in the Slavic area or in the Italian area, and you don't find it widespread in other areas, for example. It's much more, according to me, a matter of environment, let's say, a military environment. Probably in the Italian case because of lots of crossbow, because crossbow warfare was the most intense in there. And in Eastern Europe, among the Lithuanians and other Slavs, and Slavs in general, excuse me, because of horse archery, because of great use of horse archery, especially in the East. And Lithuania, in this sense, is pretty East, right? So it kind of makes sense. And it would be interesting to study also in the case of Russia, but I suspect that in here, as I was saying before, there is also a matter of like probably in there were horse archery was so intense that it was even better, like there were so many horse archers, even more in proportion than in Lithuania, let's assume. So at that point it was maybe more effective to have larger amounts of them, even more likely equipped. Well, this Lithuanian pavis seems something relatively heavier, so probably comes from a situation where it's part maybe of a people that is more sedentarized. It's in this sense more stratified, and therefore the equipment, the shields that are produced are can be fielded especially by this elite. And remember, these are seals of some of the wealthiest guys in Lithuania, are heavier, right? So we should consider this and calibrate the judgment according to this, and consider that our biggest problem is that it's not that we know a big deal on how really the average Lithuanian shield was at this time. I mean, we take that traditionally the Lithuanians had developed this kind of forms already from some century, as we've seen, even in eastern Poland as well, but we know dreadfully few about what material culture was like. Also because shields were normally made of wood. Those are things that dissolve over time. So it's basically that there is too few archaeological evidence to claim that, we know, broadly speaking, how it was, characteristically speaking. I mean, in terms of characterization of this local warfare, right? But for this matter, surely there were Lithuanian shields with a round shape, or with other shapes, and always remember that every trooper, every fighter at this point kind of uses shields, even making it by themselves. I mean, at this point, I presume the majority of Lithuanian warriors would still build weapons by themselves, right? There wasn't such a huge market. However, a very important thing that I wanted to stress, that maybe introduces also to the next topic, is the increasing professionalization of Lithuanian warfare. So basically European warfare as a whole at this point in history undergoes a process of professionalization. It happens in part because the continent becomes wealthier, so monetary economy is more developed. Here, elites and kind of centralized governmental structures can start to appear timidly, but they start to appear, and therefore there is this process that there is kind of the rich, powerful guy, like even this, like Vytautas could be, for example, that pay other troops. They're not summoned with the usual tribal levy, the thing, but they're simply paid. This is evident even in Western Europe, the scutage, think about the indenture in England or the condotta in Italy. So really, this is normal, and this is obvious because let's say military equipment becomes increasingly more expensive at this point. like, look at this equipment we have just described now. These are ultra heavy guys. So these people need to have a huge amount of wealth. And yet, some of them are actually mercenaries, right? They're not even... I mean, they're surely into the midst of, kind of feudal, let's say, organizations. Like they are into this political mix that naturally makes them being sedentarized to receive land and to fight for the Grand Duke, let's say, something like that. So they're not simply wandering mercenaries, but they do have, in part, that character. They start having it. So there are this nuclei of really toughly equipped guys that start professionalizing and specializing, let's say, tactically speaking, and in this case chiefly for heavy cavalry tactics, right? If you see what happens, in fact, even in Western Europe, it's the same. The spread of mercenaries and mercenary companies, they're mostly their critical core is about heavily armored cavalrymen, because that's the best they can have. They're always supported by other troops that are also, in this sense, kind of get more specialized. With crossbows in this time, in the late 14th century, firearms are developing even among infantry in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, it takes a bit more because those cost a lot, and not all Eastern European powers can afford that. And also, they don't have much of know-how because there are a few cities, and the craftsmen usually come from other countries, or at least they bring technologies that find a fertile ground to develop in other kind of socio-economical areas. So naturally, this is still largely a rural world, etc. So there is another typology of shield that I haven't found really in here. I don't think it's not even present in the pictures that I'm showing you here, but it's basically even heavier than the average. That shields are normally encumbrant, even if they're made of wood. This is in part made with large iron scales as well. This is a proof of this, getting heavier of the men-at-arms at this point. It was all wooden and basically rectangular in shape, a bit like just like the pavese, orientatively speaking. And it has this iron rim and is faced with large iron scales, so that's pretty heavy, right? It's probably also not very large because you can't have in one hand something that is covered in iron scales and pretending to use it effectively without tiring yourself too much. But that can be in part, let's say, the exasperation in one sort of sense of the Lithuanian pavese. That is, modestly sized shield that you can use on horseback, that is, used against so much fire that you need to add iron scales to it, right? So you could argue, well, this probably has to do not necessarily more with more arrows, but their degree of penetration. It is possible. It is possible as well, of course. And just remember, the Lithuanians were fighting against the Teutonics, for example. Crossbows were spreading also generally around, so it's possible that it was about this as well. Especially for that crossbows are pretty precise, they have long range, so given that Lithuanian armies were mostly about cavalry, horses and their, in general, horse and horsemen altogether are a pretty big target. And we know from medieval warfare in general that wherever there were lots of crossbows, usually, horses were the preferred target. So in this case, obviously, the knight with such a shield would mostly defend himself, really not the horse. Always bearing in mind that there were at this time also there was a horse armor, both in mail or in scales, There is evidence, I think, of this also of Lithuanian cavalry with such an equipment. This was also, especially scale armor, is typical bit of Eastern Europe, also the Asia, these areas where in fact the horse archery was more developed. And it kind of makes sense because always bear in mind that that's kind of the ultra elite, right? That's a kind of armor that you can't have in large. You can't fill the large numbers. There was never a time in history in which average cavalry was armored. Like only the ultra elite was, and it costed an enormous much. So surely figures like Kęstutis and Vytautas could be representatives of this. I mean, those as great dukes of Lithuania and some of the most powerful figures in this context could definitely afford this. But also in here there is a matter of functionality as well. Naturally, the more heavily you're equipped, and the more you become cumbersome, and you have troubles to even tactically speaking to employ such weight, because as we were saying before, especially Lithuanian terrain is not very fitting for very flat open grounds like this. They're mostly forests, so it's pretty tough ground that you prefer, even as an aristocrat, to have maybe a more agile horse. But this is also very theoretical. It really depends. Surely I suspect the elite of the Lithuanian, let's say the Grand Duke's bodyguard surely had also armored horses, etc. But probably they didn't make for large bodies of troops. I mean, it's still possible, but you need to find the right place to employ them. Always remember, you can have scale armor, but maybe you can't take it off if at that point it's more convenient, so it's perfectly fine. But just for saying that shields with iron scales definitely appear also elsewhere, but they remain something rare. And they were probably unusual, but not really uncommon. Let's put it in this sense. So, as we were saying before, aside from this more specific characteristics in Lithuanian warfare, we have to say that especially late 14th century Lithuania was undergoing a process of considerable westernization. This was happening mostly through Poland and the Teutonic Order, right? And this is normal, right? Because Eastern Europe, like Russia, east of Lithuania, was still relatively untouched by westernization and military equipment. As we were saying before, Poland had undergone, since a very early age, sound westernization of equipment, right? At this point, especially a northwestern Polish cavalryman, but at this point, probably, late 14th century, kind of all in Poland, would look absolutely identical to, let's say, to a German knight. Naturally, the Teutonic Order was a German order connected with the rest of Germany, the Hanseatic League, and all the Western technology and military traditions. So those would be the channels through which Lithuania, that eventually sides, as you know, with Poland. So they choose to convert to Catholicism, to Roman Catholicism, to get into the Western orbit. Gets a lot of this Western style equipment. There is a seal that I haven't been able to find that is, however, from 1385, that depicts the same Grand Duke Vytautas with German armor, right? A typical Western style armor. And in fact, he in Vytautas is recorded to have worn similar armor, at least, under a black surcoat at the Battle of Pandenburg, right? So even the battle in which it was theoretically, ideally, let's say, the Poles and the Lithuanians against the Germans, as the historiography has painted, like, this kind of the Slavs versus, they say this eastern side versus part of the western side, but obviously it wasn't like that. Like, there were lots of these intersections, and therefore it's absolutely not. There is absolutely nothing strange to find such, let's say, adoptions of Western equipment, and we can imagine that, especially after the union with Poland, Lithuanian boyars would, especially the wealthiest ones, would widely adopt such armor. And from one side is normal, because probably even I don't know about this, but surely the union with Poland brought Lithuania into much broader nets, let's say, many ways. It definitely there was an intensification of relations with the West. Never forget, Lithuania still did a lot of relation with the East even after the wars. But it's normal that at this point, having a German armor, especially with plate armor and all, is of course getting kind of the best, because this armor was pretty standard all over the West, and it was kind of the most advanced. Surely they bought a lot of this armor also from elsewhere. This at least happened for every, especially these Eastern European markets, that sometimes there were markets from not just Germany but also from Italy, for example. And also for artillery, actually, because they didn't have, as we were saying, so that the know-how, so that they would look at these lands where those things were more advanced. But they could be, after all, using this armor, a way, like a political slogan, like saying, buying a German armor is theoretically, the idea is that siding the union with Poland. The idea that definitely there was some resistance in Lithuania to this union. There were lots of boyars that probably would have preferred to remain, and would remain, in contact and in better relations with other Eastern neighbors. So wearing that armor meant also to be part of something else, like more Westernly oriented, and it was also probably in part political. But I'm not really speculating. I'm sure about this, but obviously you can't never know about what was in the head of a Lithuanian boyar in the 14th century. But probably it did correspond in part also to this, always bearing in mind that, as we've seen these seals, also the traditional Lithuanian equipment was probably used in this very same function instead, in the same opposite function in some ways, right? But also in here probably wasn't a lot of resistance over time, also because simply, military technology was fastly evolving towards full plate armor and all, so it was obvious that things would evolve into that direction at the end of the day, right? So, yes, and I think there's not much to add to this. Always bearing in mind that, so you might, let's stop it here, because there would be else to say, but we'll maybe do it on another occasion. So, I don't know how to conclude this. I think I had to say everything I had. My suggestion, maybe I leave you with an advice, is that never think that we can actually know positivistically how certain styles and traditions evolved at this time. Like, especially in the case of the pavis that we spent quite an amount of time about today, the concept is always think that a people doesn't quite need to get an idea from another or know-how from another in order to develop it, right? If I say, for example, that artillery was being developed chiefly in Western Europe, it is right, and it is right to say that, in fact, as we know, this Eastern kingdoms, like even Poland or Lithuania, the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, did have, at least we have later records for the appearance of artillery in there, right? And this is obvious because it's a matter of structural development. Like, these lands could do better without in some ways. They remained in many ways traditional even later on. I mean, if you take the winged hussars, you know, that's an anachronism of success in those lands even in the early modern period that effectively copes even with Western military style. So let's say that always remember that what works still remains in function, and that sometimes it's hard to change a tradition, but at the end of the day, if there is a fertile soil for that to develop, that will happen. Obviously, you know, always the sense of artillery. Artillery is extremely costly, so you can't have it so easily, and that's why these countries will keep mostly buying it from other states before trying to build kind of their own on a large scale. But in the case of armor, for example, that is something, or shields, that are something relatively cheaper, especially shields, as you can imagine. Well, when you look at these shapes and forms, and you can't really say, well, this was taken from someone else, or where was the pavis created first? Like, we were the first to do it, so the others copy it to us. No, it doesn't work like that. Shapes and functions develop in military environments that are already oriented for doing that, and it's not really a matter of improvement on a progressive scale. Because if there is a factor that makes you that not useful for you, you simply don't use it, and that's not a proof of backwardness. It's simply a matter of functionality, right? So you don't need to have a type of shield, especially shields. Like, they're just pieces of wood. It's not that there are immense, diverse ways you can make a shield, conceptually. That's always basically the same thing. And if you think that these massive differences are, the differences are so massively important, you don't know how shields really, what shields are needed for at the end of the day, what weight they have at the end of the day. So my take is, let's search, yes, for this kind of paths of threads that can lead us to say, okay, well, this probably originated here, but let's try to understand first why they originated there, right? It's not a matter of it's not necessarily a matter of particular development. It can also be a matter of functionality, especially when the know-how is so easily available, right? Like in the case of shields. In case of artillery, it's more complicated. You really need something larger. You need structures. You need certain social classes. It's not easy to get it quickly, so you can't buy it from someone else. But shields, no. And if they do form in another way, it's probably mostly a functional thing. Okay, so yeah, I can close with this. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.